I may not look like an old doctor. I graduated from medical school in 2009, but I can confidently say that our treatment of MS is getting better. I remember being a resident and a fellow, and we had a lot of patients with bad MS flares getting admitted to the hospital, receiving steroids or plasmapheresis, and a lot of people acquired more disabilities than they do today. Certainly, though, we have a long way to go, but I feel confident that over time things will get better. And in this video, I want to speculate about what changes could occur in the rest of my career. Now, it's hard to predict these things. There could be generalized AI next year powered by superpowered computers, and we could double our knowledge of MS in a single minute, or maybe things will stagnate for the next 10 or 20 years, and things may not be that much different, though I'm optimistic for the future. And the first thing I think could get better is just better use of existing technology. Even if there were no innovations and we just optimally used what we have today, life could be a lot better for people with MS. A lot of the treatments we have are old. For instance, the drug Tysabri was first FDA approved in 2005, but a lot of people were afraid to use it. It was only reserved for people who had failed less efficacious disease-modifying therapies. Now it's well known that it can be used in young people with newly diagnosed relapsing MS with low disability, and often those people have a very good prognosis. Also, the JC virus antibody didn't exist. We didn't have the data on who has the greatest risk of PML, the feared side effect, the brain infection caused by the JC virus. That's a rare side effect of PML. So it was very difficult to use this drug. It could only be used in a small number of people. Another example would be B-cell depleting therapies. Rituximab has been used in MS since the early 2000s, of course, is very effective, but wasn't commonly used at this time. It wasn't until trials on rituximab, such as the Olympus trial in progressive MS, for example, and the Hermes trial in relapsing MS, and then other B-cell depleting drugs like Ocrevus and now Kesimpta and Briumvi, is this strategy commonly used. And now people are more comfortable with the side effects, comfortable with long-term dosing and management of risks and monitoring immunoglobulins and infections, that type of thing, that it can benefit a significant percentage of people with multiple sclerosis. So imagine a world where our MRI scans weren't any better, but every MRI scan in someone suspected to have MS was read by an experienced neuroradiologist, and everyone was evaluated by a neurologist very experienced with multiple sclerosis, so that misdiagnosis would be rare, and then utilization of highly effective treatments early in the disease, ideally prior to significant disability being accumulated. I think even that, with no further innovations, could make a huge difference. Going back to diagnosis for a moment, there are essentially two issues with MS diagnosis in the current era. One is underdiagnosis, people with MS not getting diagnosed promptly. Now, in my experience, people with classic symptoms, like a young woman with optic neuritis, they tend to be diagnosed fairly quickly. But some people have non-specific symptoms, maybe numbness that's patchy or brief or in an unusual distribution. And of course, it could be the incompetence of medical providers, but some people just have symptoms that aren't specifically characteristic of multiple sclerosis. The patient doesn't read the textbook, as they say, and doctors are just imperfect, and maybe it's not practical to do an MRI on every single person with every neurological symptom. But imagine in the future where MRI scans were very inexpensive, where interpretation of MRI scans could be done expertly either by neuroradiologists who were abundant, or even artificial intelligence. Or even we could be doing whole body screening MRI scans in the general population. I understand that likely isn't practical in the current time, and there would be a lot of problems, like many incidental findings. But imagine that this was inexpensive, accurate, interpreted by artificial intelligence, and you could diagnose MS in the so-called radiologically isolated syndrome stage, or at least at the first symptomatic stage, No doubt that would lead to better outcomes if aggressive treatment was initiated promptly, assuming no misdiagnosis. Now, that leads me to the other problem. Unfortunately, misdiagnosis of MS is very common in the current era, and I've seen people who are incorrectly diagnosed with MS and treated with disease-modifying therapies for years or even more than a decade in rare cases. There was one study done at UCLA and Cedars-Sinai that found a misdiagnosis rate of around 17%. Now, I don't think it's currently that high, but it does occur. And the reality is human doctors like me, we're imperfect. We make mistakes sometimes. We misinterpret nonspecific, unidentified bright objects, subcortical white matter lesions on MRI scans as being typical of demyelinating disease. We need technology that will make it idiot-proof. And I think that it may be coming. The central venule sign, the central vein within multiple sclerosis plaques, even advanced PET scans that show activated microglia or other aspects of the immune system showing that it's an inflammatory process. I think we could potentially make diagnosis of MS idiot-proof and not only avoid misdiagnosis, but give human doctors the confidence to know the diagnosis is unequivocal, and then we can treat it aggressively. Next, let's move to medications. And there are different types of medications, but I want to start by focusing on medications that work on the immune system, which is how our current disease-modifying therapies work. And a lot of them are very effective and have reasonable side effect profiles, but unfortunately, the stronger medications aren't perfectly safe. Now, I mentioned Tysabri earlier, and it has this problem with the risk of PML, a JC virus-mediated brain infection. But what if it didn't? What if it could be a smarter version of Tysabri, a Tysabri that didn't block all the lymphocytes from entering the central nervous system? What if it let in certain lymphocytes, B and T cells, to protect the central nervous system against infection? Could it be equally effective and have no risk of PML? Maybe we could give it with impunity to people who are JC virus antibody positive with a high index, for example. What about B cell depleting agents? What if you had an Ocrevus that didn't kill all of the B cells? It only killed the autoreactive B lymphocytes. You can imagine that it may be the case that 99.99% of B lymphocytes in someone with multiple sclerosis are completely harmless, have no tendency to attack the central nervous system, and it's a tiny number, 1 in 10,000, that are the actual culprit. What if we could target those selectively? You could have a drug that's just as effective as Ocrevus or the other B-cell depleters, but without the risk of infections, without the risk of low antibodies, a drug that you could give continuously every 6 months, forever, indefinitely, with no significant risk. And also, there's a tendency for us to be afraid to give these drugs to certain people. Let's say someone is 65 years old. They've already been admitted to the hospital twice this year for pneumonia. We're afraid to give them a powerful immunosuppressant, especially one that doesn't have randomized controlled trial evidence in this age group. But if it had no risk of infections, we could give it with impunity, presuming that it was effective, which I suppose is not currently proven. And so I believe even for relapsing MS, there's a lot of room for improvement. We could have drugs that are equally effective but safer, or perhaps even more effective and completely safe. Now, the other class of medications I could talk about are medications that don't work in the same way. They don't work directly with the immune system. Certainly, there are some people with progressive MS who don't seem to respond to current disease-modifying therapies, or at least don't respond completely. Ideally, we have something that is 100% effective, or at least 90% effective at stopping progression in the future. Now, it's hard for me to speculate on what will come through for these people because we don't have a definitive grasp on the underlying pathophysiology of progressive MS. Many people believe that there's a low level of inflammation within older lesions or even in normal appearing parts of the brain, at least normal on conventional MRI, smoldering multiple sclerosis, as they say. And there are even some drugs that may be available shortly, like tolebrutinib, a Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitor, that could treat it, but they don't seem to be blockbuster effective, if you will. Maybe we'll have something something that's very effective at targeting specifically this low level of inflammation without causing too many side effects. There's some other theories on progressive MS, the idea of mitochondrial failure within the neurons. In other words, there's old damage to the axon, and this puts metabolic stress on the cell itself, even though there's no inflammatory pathology within the cell. Is there some new drug we could give that would support the metabolic activity of the stressed neuron and prevent neurodegeneration? Or are there other factors at play, like low-level activity of Epstein-Barr virus, or even low-level activity of something like human endogenous retrovirus W? I can't say for sure. There's also a serious possibility of a drug that's truly regenerative in nature, something that could cause remyelination, repair of previously demyelinated axons. Will it be something already in development, like Pipe 307, or something we have never heard of and could hardly conceive? Could the drug NVG-291 being studied in traumatic brain injury be effective for people with MS? Or could there be some other similar drug that achieves axonal sprouting in animal models that could be beneficial in multiple sclerosis? I definitely think it's possible, and we'll eventually see some type of neuroregenerative drug in my lifetime. Another thing is lifestyle. Right now, with current available evidence, I can't say definitively that taking a vitamin D supplement is beneficial or taking an omega-3 supplement is beneficial. I can't say which diet is best. I can't say definitively you should have a whole foods plant-based diet or include seafood or a paleo diet or, for instance, a keto diet. But what if we had large randomized trials demonstrating that one of these approaches is clearly superior? It could be recommended to all people with MS earlier in the disease. And what if we had some kind of technology that helped people follow these diets very strictly and they had a large biological effect, reducing disability in the long run? That could make a huge difference. And the last thing is, even if some people did have significant long-standing disabilities that couldn't be totally reversed, other technologies would likely improve their quality of life a lot. I actually recently went out dancing with my wife, and there was a gentleman using a wheelchair who was dancing and having the time of his life. And I thought to myself, what if he was born a few hundred years ago before wheelchairs were available? His life would be so different than it is now. And that's such a simple technology, a chair attached to wheels. But imagine a future where someone with significant paralysis of the lower extremities had something like a fully functional exoskeleton that they could use expertly to walk upstairs. And let's say the technology to have everything you needed delivered by drone to your home was readily accessible and inexpensive, even for people with limited income because they were disabled and unable to work. And you could get everywhere you needed to go on high-speed rail that was disability accessible, and you could use different technologies to compensate for your weaknesses, whether they be related to hearing or vision or something else, and you could just live a better life despite your disability overall. And so I would predict that by the end of my career, we'll see that people with MS tend to get diagnosed faster, more accurately, are treated more aggressively, and have a better prognosis than people in the current era. I'd be interested to know your thoughts. Do you think I'm being too optimistic or not optimistic enough? It's really difficult to predict future technologies. Do you think there are other changes in diagnosis or treatment of MS that I'm missing? Do you think it's possible we could eliminate MS altogether, for instance, by treating a certain root cause like Epstein-Barr virus? And do you have any ideas for other videos?